Welcome to New College, welcome to the University of Edinburgh. It's a great pleasure to see you all here on this prestigious and special inaugural event. My name is Professor Jeremy Carrette. I'm the head of the School of Divinity, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all to this inaugural lecture of Professor Gordon Lynch in honour of his appointment to the Chair of Religion, Society and Ethics. And it's great to see everybody here, and in particular delight to welcome Donna and Hanny and Sammy to the event, and to all friends who've travelled here to celebrate with Gordon this evening. Welcome to you all. Inaugural lectures are moments of celebration. A celebration of academic achievement in the appointment to a professorial status at the University of Edinburgh. And it's my pleasure, as part of the tradition of inaugural lectures, to say a few words before handing over to Professor Gordon Lynch for his lecture. Professor Gordon Lynch, and I've agreed that I will say Gordon, as I've known Gordon for a while, was born in Tunbridge Wells in England, and he holds a first degree in theology from the University of Durham, an MA in History of Art and Design from Birmingham Institute of Art and Design, and a PhD in Practical Theology at the University of Birmingham. He also completed a postgraduate professional training in psychodynamic counselling. And he's been here in Edinburgh since September 2024, having previously been the Michael Ramsey Professor of Modern Theology at the University of Kent from 2010 to 2024, and Professor of Sociology of Religion at Birkbeck College, University of London, from 2007 to 2010. Previously, lecturer in social and pastoral theology at the University of Birmingham. His research focuses on meaning and values that fall outside or extend beyond institutional religion, including the role of popular culture as a source of meaning and value, including his works After Religion, Generation X and the Search for Meaning, DLT 2002, which was explored work on club culture. There's some great pictures if you ever can find them. And other works like Understanding Theology and Popular Culture, Wiley and Blackley from 2004. He's also explored the new spirituality in Western societies in his book, The New Spirituality, An Introduction to Belief Beyond Religion, I.B. Taurus in 2007, critically engaging with a range of scholars who shall be nameless on a similar subject. He's also explored how societies continue to be shaped by ideas of sacred and moral values in his works Between the Sacred and Profane, Researching Religion and Popular Culture, I.B. Taurus from 2007, and The Sacred in the Modern World, A Cultural Sociological Approach, Oxford University Press 2021, and also related to this theme, On the Sacred by Acumen in 2012. He's also worked extensively on issues of religion and abuse with his works Remembering Child Migration, Faith, Nation Building and the Wounds of Charity, Bloomsbury 2015, and UK Child Migration to Australia, 1945 to 1970, from Palgrave Macmillan in 2021. In my view, what makes Gordon's work particularly significant is, as he says in his work on the sacred, his desire for conversations between disciplines. This exploration across disciplines is, I would like to suggest, the possibility of opening and drawing out three key issues in his work: the relations to society, the relations to identity, and the relations to value. And we can just briefly note those three types of relation in his work. From the first, which follows the rigour of sociological empirical analysis, which is an exploration of case studies and of pastoral counselling, interviews of clubbers, interviews with post-evangelicals, appreciation of survey data in the progressive spirituality work, and today historical data which is found in his empirical work on migration and abuse. And part of the approach of this sociological sensitivity is to research method and what he calls to the recognition of the complexity of negotiating one's position as a researcher. In relation to identity, there is a quest to understand that identity in contemporary culture, and working through the lens of his own experience in and through that contemporary cultural space. And this takes on added significance in Gordon's work with the personal and intellectual journey that he's made through the post-evangelical position to a progressive spirituality, to cultural sociology, and to his present work on public values. There's a research for the meaning of identity in late modernity. And finally, his work explores that relation to values. And here I find the extraordinary continuity in his thinking, a concern with the good life, the social and public values. And we might say that his work is best captured in his first publication, Pastoral Care and Counselling from Sage 2002, which significantly appeared in a special series on practical ethics. And in the foreword to that work, on his longtime mentor, Professor Stephen Patterson, who notes the strength of the work is the appreciation of cultural diversity and the ability to develop a critical thinking to the Western ethical codes in counselling. But it is this early work which demonstrates the continuity of his work on values. As Gordon says in that work, his aim, and I quote, was to explore what it means to think about the good life in relation to the social context. Arguments in that book on pastoral counselling are inspired by a vision and question of what is the good life. And this strand of his thinking is, I think, its deepest core. It moves from an Aristotelian vision of the good life through to recognising that the good life, and I quote, will mean thinking critically about a whole range of questions of popular cultural representation and explorations of what it means to live well. And this is explored in the context of that moral sensitivity in progressive spirituality and in his work on the sacred, through to his understanding of Durkheim and the sacred, and the holding of what he calls the absolute realities that exert a profound claim on all our lives. It's also fascinating in these works to understand that the good life is always, for Gordon, situated, and I quote, in specific social institutions. And his recent work demonstrates that very clearly, where he's not just looking at this in an academic context, but its application to living and engaged institutional contexts. And in this regard, his personal career highlights demonstrate that outreach beyond academia, and is more to do, as he says, with constructive contributions to people's lives beyond academic debate. And this can be highlighted when we explore some of the particular highlights that Gordon identifies in his work. First, his co-curation of the national exhibition on the history of UK child migration programmes at the V&A Museum of Childhood in London, which helped to raise the profile of the suffering of former British child migrants during a period when issues of child abuse were gaining national attention. And in his work for the Independent Inquiry into Child Sexual Abuse, which helped to provide evidence of the UK government findings in the management of the schemes that led to the setting up of the £32 million compensation scheme for former British child migrants. And his work in the Scottish Child Abuse Inquiry in using new archival analysis to demonstrate collusion between abusers of the Christian Brothers institution in Western Australia, which campaigners had previously struggled to gain justice for. These elements demonstrate the engaged understanding of values, and his recent work continues this with a focus on the particular nature of values, working with students here on his course Understanding Your Values, of which I think you saw pictures of at the beginning of this lecture, which is the subject of what he will be talking about this evening. We should note, incredibly, amongst all of that work, that he's also contributed enormously to the field of theology and religious studies as a public discipline, serving as a member of the REF panel in 2014 and being the chair of the REF panel in 2021 and now again the chair of the REF panel in 2028. It shows his commitment to the subject but also to the values of the subject itself. And behold, there is spare time. And in that, I understand that he's a failing electronic musician, of which I think I'm not sure about the failing, but I think we're about to hear some of this at the start of his lecture. Would you all please welcome Gordon Lynch, Professor of Religion, Society and Ethics.
Lovely to see you all. I'm very grateful for you all being here today. Thank you to Jeremy for those kind words. I think Jeremy's read more of my work than I have, so that was really interesting to hear about it. I hope you took notes about all of the publications that he listed, because you will be tested on those before receiving drinks or nibbles downstairs as well. I'm very touched, very grateful to see so many people here tonight. Delighted to see colleagues from the School of Divinity here. Really thrilled to see students that I've taught across the foundation course on Christian nationalism in America, on understanding your values and morality through the social sciences as well. It's great to see you all here as well. And colleagues from across the university, from beyond Edinburgh as well. You're all welcome here, whatever your connection to the school, and it's great to be able to share this occasion with you, so thank you for that. Pippa and Rory, as Jeremy said, thank you ever so much for all the work that goes on with organising this. I think we should give you a round of applause for that. And just to say, as Jeremy mentioned, it's a real pleasure to share this with my family, to Hanny, who's really establishing himself in the music scene here in Edinburgh, to Sammy, who's my morning games of yellow car really get my pulse racing in the morning, and to Duna, who's been such a source of wisdom and fun and goodness in her life. And it's really good that we'll be coming back to actually work that you did before we come to the end of the lecture this evening. But I'm also going to think about people not here this evening. As Jeremy mentioned, I've always been very lucky in my career, and one of the big bits of luck that I had was meeting Stephen when I was a doctoral student. Stephen got me through my first journal article, which took several iterations because I was so enraged by the peer review process. He backed me with a really difficult professional decision that I had to make that really freed me up to do all the work that Jeremy's described this evening, and he was a constant support, despite being so far ahead of me in his career, really showed me what collaborative work meant. And when I think about what I've come to value most in my work, thinking about trying to extend our focus in our subject area beyond traditional institutional religion, thinking about the ways in which values and ethics play out in social life, or being concerned with issues of power and abuse, I realised that Stephen was always there before me. And so, whilst he's not here with us this evening, he's very much here in my words. So, let's get going. I'm going to start tonight with a paraphrase of something that former student once said to me. He said, "I feel lost. I don't know what I think, and I don't know what I believe." And sitting there with that student in that moment, it didn't feel as if they were just unsure about the assignment that we were working on together. They were talking about something deeper, something existential. And they went on to get a very good grade for the work we were doing together, but I doubt that anything we did together really helped them with that deeper sense of malaise. And if I'm honest, I felt disturbed that this student, who was coming towards the end of their time in our subject area studying for their degree, was still carrying such a sense of a yawning gap in their sense of who they were, their meaning of their life, and their place in the world. And this lecture is really a response to that student, and to all of us here tonight who want to ask personal questions of meaning and value. Now, as Jeremy said, unusually for an inaugural lecture, I'm going to talk about an educational intervention tonight, although it's one which is based on my own long-term research interests, which I'm not going to talk about because Jeremy's already done that, but here's the glorious book covers that you didn't get to see earlier. But I'm going to introduce this by turning to another quote, and this is, I'm smuggling in my interest in electronic music here, by using a quote from Daphne Oram, one of the pioneers in the field who co-founded the BBC Radiophonic Workshop. And she once wrote about innovation, saying, "New developments are rarely, if ever, the complete and singular achievement of one mind. If neither Edison nor Crowe had come forward with the invention of the phonograph, someone else would surely have done so within a short space of time. Obviously, the time was ripe for just such experiments." And the experiment that I'm going to talk to you about tonight is a course in practicing moral self-reflection that we've developed here called Understanding Your Values. It is, to use Oram's words, definitely not the complete and singular achievement of one mind. It's part of a much wider body of scholarship over the past 60 years that has tried to broaden questions and methods in our subject area way beyond the boundaries of traditional institutional religion. And educational initiatives growing out of Divinity that help students to reflect on their existential and moral commitments aren't unique here either. Thinking about the Life Worth Living programme at Yale and really were really valuable, creative, inclusive approaches to doing practical theology that colleagues elsewhere are doing as well. Heather, I've lost you in the room, but Heather, it's a pleasure having you here tonight, and sorry that Katie wasn't able to join us from Aberdeen. So the work that I'm talking about builds very much on the ideas and the experiments of other people, but it's also work that I think the time is very much ripe for, as I'll explain by the end of the lecture. It's not the only form or contribution that our subject area can make, but I do think what I'm talking about tonight is a vital one for us to develop. And by the end of this talk, I'm hoping to have shown that understanding your values is just one part of a much bigger project that I think we need to develop and that I think we can all play a part in building in the future. So like all good talks, this comes in 3 parts. If you're like me, I'm not a great lecturer goer, and I tend to get a bit nervous sitting in a room while someone talks at me for a long period of time. So just, if you're like me, just to give you reassurance to begin with, that part 1 is the longest part of all 3. So if you're sitting there and you're looking at your watch and part 1 hasn't come to an end, it's okay. There's also going to be a little bit of a mid-break, which I'll explain more in due course. Also, if you hear from morality through the social sciences, some of these ideas and even some of the jokes will be familiar to you in the class that we've covered before, but you are also going to see them in a bigger context here. You're going to understand a little bit more about why we're doing what we're doing in that class and how it can fit a bigger picture. So, just as I was coming to the end of my PhD, I got to teach my first course, which happened to be an introduction to ethics. I took a really conventional approach to doing that. I introduced students to ethical theories like deontological, consequentialist and virtue ethics approaches. We looked at different critical debates about the strengths and weaknesses of those approaches, and we thought about those all in relation to specific ethical problems. When I look back at my work, then, what strikes me is my almost complete lack of curiosity about the moral assumptions and commitments that the students had coming into that course. And I now see that lack of curiosity on my part as a fundamental mistake, because we don't come to ethical thinking as blank sheets with no previous moral formation, and nor are our moral instincts just quirks of history that we dispense with as soon as we're exposed to proper ethical theories. In fact, there's one school of thought in moral psychology which suggests that it's our moral emotions, our moral instincts that are really running the show, and that the ethical arguments, the theories that we use, are just post hoc justifications that we use later on to kind of give a bit of a PR coverage for ourselves. Now, maybe that view's too strong, but I'm going to argue in this first part that morality is deeply rooted in us as social animals, and as a result, we only begin to really understand our moral lives when we understand who we already are and we take moral responsibility for that. So let's take our experience of social life first. So again, people on morality through the social sciences will be familiar with this book, the work of Erving Goffman, on the way in which morality is bound up with our everyday social interactions. And what Goffman was essentially arguing here was that in modern societies, we exist in a series of complex roles and relationships, each with their own moral norms. And in our relationships, we never fully disclose who we are. We never disclose all of our thoughts and feelings. Imagine how difficult the workplace would be if we did that. So instead, what we give are performances that are calibrated to the particular expectations of the role that we're in. So we can think about how we're very different with our friends, to a family member, to a church we might be a member of, to when we are as employees or other groups that we're part of. Very different in some groups that we're in online to our offline world as well. Now, one of the things that people noticed often when they did understanding your values really early on was that they recognised that their values actually changed depending on the relationship or the group that they were in, and that can actually be quite an unsettling recognition. It can raise questions about what our authentic values really are, and we can also become more aware of how alienating it is when we feel compelled to give moral performances that don't really resonate deeply with us. But it's not just in terms of our everyday social interactions that morality is deeply embedded. It's also in the way in which we think about society, because the most basic way in which we imagine societies depend on moral boundaries. Our very practice of society is structured around ideas about who's a true member of our moral community, what's sacred to us, and what's a polluting threat, or who's a polluting threat, which, depending on your moral framework, can be Ayatollah Khomeini, Donald Trump, liberals, the far right, Nigel Farage, or human rights lawyers. Moral stories and emotions aren't just a sideshow for social life or how it's structured, they're central to it. They legitimise power, they tell us who we can and can't grieve publicly for, and they inspire people to kill or to give up their lives. And from Watergate to Partygate to whatever kind of gate we're going through right now, people who have what appears to be unassailable power, when they transgress the deepest values of a society, will find that that power dissipates and erodes all too quickly. But moralities, I want to argue tonight, aren't just a feature of modern society. They're not just deeply embedded into modern society in that way. They actually run deeply into the way in which the human brain and mind has evolved. And whilst the growing field of moral psychology still has many questions to resolve, and it's great having Matty here tonight as such a kind of leading practitioner in that field, there are 2 points about which we can be reasonably confident. The first is that our brains have evolved primarily to function as evaluative and predictive organs. Now, we normally like to think of ourselves as rational beings who make rational judgments around the world around us based on our unfiltered experience of that world. But in reality, our brains are always predicting what's about to happen to us and evaluating what threats and opportunities there might be for us. Unconscious, intuitive, and emotional evaluations of the world around us goes on in our brain usually well before our conscious reasoning processes have a chance to kick in. And to speed these processes up, our brains rely on patterns that we can call heuristics, patterns based on our previous experience. And so our intuitive and emotional sense of what's good or bad, who is morally good, morally bad, whether something is a threat to us or beneficial to us, could then be described as moral heuristics. So a very extreme example that we considered in morality through the social sciences is that if you're downstairs in the rainy hall, you're queuing for the cafe, it's a long queue, you're feeling peckish, and your friend turns to you and says, it's too late to kind of wait for a sandwich, why don't we just eat the person in front of us? Instinctively, I hope, you know that's not a good thing to do. You don't need to go through a rational process of checking through your deontological ethics to know that that is probably not the right thing to do, and you sidle quickly away from your friend. So along with those kind of moral heuristics that are built into the kind of evaluative and predictive nature of our brains, the second point is that the longer evolution of that animal brain that we carry within us took an even sharper moral focus as human evolution led to more complex forms of communication and social organisation. And so put simply, there's a reasonable argument that particular forms of morality conferred evolutionary advantages to our human ancestors. And so to demonstrate this point, I want you to welcome Barry and Keith. I have to say at this point, we don't know that our human early ancestors were called Barry and Keith or not. That's purely speculative, but they're here for illustrative purposes. Now, I want you to imagine Barry and Keith being in competition with each other for limited resources and trying to manage threats in their environment. If it's just a case of the two of them duking it out between them, then the survival of the fittest really will probably be a case of who's healthier, who's quicker, who's stronger, who's more quick-witted, which for the morality through the social sciences group, most people went for Keith, but there was a minority view that actually Barry had something going on for him because he had a stick. So I think we can see that point of view as well. But if Barry is able to build, or the Barrys of this world are able to build up successful collaborative relationships, not just through their immediate kinship group, but through a wider group or tribe around them, then they'll have a much greater potential for survival and growth through gathering resources, protecting each other, and dealing with other threats and risks. But if Keith then gets himself sorted out, and he sorts out his own group and his tribe, an evolutionary advantage could then be built into whichever of these groups has stronger rewards, a sense of reward for people who serve the group, or stronger sanctions against those who don't really serve the group or are freeloaders and not really paying their fair share, or who are disloyal. So if you're a student here, and if you feel a deep sense of rage at a member of your group presentation task who's not pulling their weight, that has a very deep evolutionary root to it. So, in short, just as nutrition would have been essential for the successful physical evolution of our human ancestors, so the ability to develop a sense of shared moral identity of care and responsibility within a defined group or tribe, that's really important to remember, that seems to have been essential for our successful social evolution. So if this is correct, then basic forms of morality, certain forms of morality, seem to be as much a form of our evolutionary inheritance as our capacity to sense danger, to judge distance, or to spatially process complex sounds. And some people would even argue that evolutionary inheritance is evident in a body, somewhat problematic body of research, which suggests that moral attentiveness to acts of hindering or helping, or to fairness or unfairness, can be observed in pre-verbal children even less than a year old. And so that long evolutionary inheritance, if we accept that, means that it's possible to argue that humans are pre-wired to particular kinds of moral concern, where the specific values that we have around what constitutes fairness, who we should care for, or what's sacred for our group, are then overlaid by the different cultural environments in which we're formed. Now, the astute amongst you, which is all of you, will have noticed there's something important in this argument that I may not yet have addressed. Now, I think there's good reasons for thinking that morality is integral to the way in which we mentally process the world, sustain our relationships, and form larger groups, and also for understanding which other people or groups are a threat to us. But that's really a statement of the integral role that morality plays in our lives as social animals. It's not really a comment on the content of that morality. So it's perfectly possible for individuals and groups to act on the basis of powerful moral symbolism, powerful moral emotion and codes within their tribes, but in ways that are actually deeply harmful. Our evolutionary pre-wiring may mean that moralities are central to our operating system, but as genocides, sectarianism, so-called honour killings, and various forms of internal group repression show, the software of specific moralities that are running through us aren't always positive. In fact, those moralities can sometimes foster the kind of rigid thinking, indifference to others' suffering, bless you, and a sense of entitlement that Gwen Adshed in her 2024 Wreath Lectures described as characteristics of evil thinking. To put it most simply, the fact that we're inherently moral doesn't necessarily mean we're inherently good. So this brings us, and we're still in part one, don't worry, we're coming to the end of part one. This brings us to a final idea that I want to introduce in terms of setting the scene for this experiment. And that's that we need to understand values, I think, as things that are both social and cultural in nature. They're formed through particular social processes and cultural processes, but we also experience them as deep fundamental moral truths. And I'm going to call this the duality of values, because what I think we need to do is to recognise that what we experience in terms of our moralities are simultaneously things that are both social and cultural in nature, but things that, if they're moralities that are important to us, we think of as significant moral truths. They're actually kind of bound together. Now, intellectually, we can kind of get that idea, I think, hopefully not too difficultly, without too much difficulty. But I think emotionally, we tend to think about our own values as basic moral truths, and we tend to think about other people's wrong values as the kind of values that are just shaped by social and cultural environments. So I know there's some of you here from the foundation class that we did on Christian Christian nationalism in America. And we saw in that class how a particular set of social and economic and cultural and religious factors following the 2008 financial crash in America can create a social environment in which people are more sympathetic to white Christian nationalism. But that way of kind of dividing, thinking between our values as being the right sort of pure, good moral values and the other values, other people's values as the ones that are sort of shaped by, historical, social, cultural processes, can sometimes be a subtext that gets played out in public life as well, where people say effectively, I act on the basis of moral truth, but you're doing virtue signalling. I maintain proper boundaries around what's decent and good, but you're doing tribalistic cancel culture. I have sincere moral conviction based on what's right, but you just have narrow-minded prejudice based on limited social experience. So it's easier to see those kind of social and historical formations on values, perhaps in other people, than sometimes in ourselves. But although it's not easy, I think holding together what we can call the psychosocial and the normative dimensions of values is important, because it means that we don't just understand our values by thinking about debates about moral truth. We also need to think about the ways in which our own moralities have been formed, whether that's through long histories of evolution, particular social and cultural histories, or our own personal experience, and thinking about the implications of that. It means learning to recognise the ways in which our own values have already been shaped by different histories, relationships, and experiences, and being ready to ask if our current moral framework is always good, or how it could be expanded. It means, fundamentally, understanding who we are as moral selves, how we've come to be like that, and what it might mean for us to become morally better people. Now, if you have been in a class with me, you will know I have a 20-minute rule in my teaching. And the 20-minute rule is that if I've been talking uninterrupted for 20 minutes, someone in the room is bored. And if it's not you, it's usually me. So there is always a little thing that takes place that breaks up me talking. And that is going to be 1 minute now. I'm just going to ask you to do this for 1 minute, where if you accept that premise that morality is pre-wired into us, that we're coming into this room, all of us, with our own moralities that have been formed either through a long evolutionary history or our cultural, historical backgrounds, what would be a question that you would ask that would help you or other people to understand your values better? What would be a question that you would ask? So what I want you to do is either think about that individually, or you may want to just turn to someone near you and just for 1 minute, just think about that question. What question do you think we should ask if we want to understand the values that we already have better? Right, we're going to move on to part two. Parts 2 and 3 we're going to cover more quickly. So I'm going to talk now about the experiment. So far I've explored the idea that morality is psychologically and socially pre-wired into us, and that reflecting on who we already are in moral terms is an integral part of how we become more moral. And so understanding your values is an experiment in how we might do that work. It's an 11-week optional course for our honours students. And so rather than taking students through a selection of ethical theories, problems or case studies, the central focus of the course is on reflective learning. And students from the outset are introduced to what reflective learning is, and through our classes we engage in various themes where the questions that we're asking are often as, if not more important than the material we're engaging with. The students write reflective journals, they take part in small discussion groups based on active listening rather than trying to win a debate through critical argument. They choose a particular source for their midterm assignment that will help them think through a particular personal, meaningful issue. And then they write a summary report at the end that draws together their whole learning from this process. And recognising the important role that moral emotions play in all of this, students are encouraged to track not just their rational, critical process of learning, but their emotional process of learning with that as well. And because this is an inherently self-involving course, it's very important from the outset to establish ground rules. We had a longer list of those, but 2 of the most important ones were that we would be kind to ourselves going through this process, and the second was that we would always be in control of our learning, and that we would always have the ability to choose not to take our reflections onto parts of our life that were too distressing or that we weren't ready to focus on. And guiding the design of the course were some basic hypotheses about how personal learning might take place in this kind of moral self-reflection. 4 elements to this. One is that our moral emotions and reflections and behaviour might be reinforced or modified through doing work on our moral identity. If that's right, a second hypothesis is that narrative or story is a central medium through which our sense of moral identity is built. And so by reflecting on or crafting stories about ourselves and about our moral lives, we will develop some capacity to understand ourselves more, to refine our moral agency, and to develop more kind of reflective power in our lives over who we are as moral selves. A third principle is that a valuable source for that kind of narrative learning would be engaging with sources beyond ourselves, whether that could be a song, a book, an idea, a person, an experience, or a moral exemplar who inspired us in some way. And finally, a hypothesis underpinning this course was that our sense of moral identity could be consciously or unconsciously shaped by wider stories that we would tell about the past, our present, and the future. And so to try these hypotheses out in practice, our classes were structured around a range of themes that would try to help us develop our stories about ourselves in new ways. So we thought about who or what was important in shaping our values in the past. We thought about whether deep history, in the sense of an idea of creation or the formation of the cosmos, we saw that with the acorn of the universe before, whether that would shape our beliefs or values in any way. We also thought about how, for some people, there are histories that are bound into their lives by virtue of the communities and the identities that they're simply embedded in, and the meaning of those histories for them. And we also wondered whether we could take moral responsibility for, learn from, take warnings from other histories as well as how our stories about the world today might actually shape our sense of what matters. We thought about what stories we tell about the future and what responsibility we might have for being good ancestors for future generations. We thought about our circle of moral concern, why we drew that circle of moral concern in the way that we did, and what changes, even if they were small, we might want to make to that. We thought about who morally inspired us and how it's usually very helpful that our moral exemplars are rarely paragons of pure virtue, because they'd be far less useful to us if they were, I think. We recognised our moral limitations and reflected on what stories we could tell ourselves about how to recognise those moral limitations and how to live well with them. It's great to have Selina in the class talking with us about those issues as well. So, what did we learn from all of this? Well, the first thing was that, for the most part, this approach was very new to the students, and we actually spent quite a lot of time talking about what it meant to do this work. We talked about what kind of self-disclosure was appropriate or needed in this class, which is self-disclosure about personal learning, not deep self-disclosure about personal background. And we also thought a lot about what it meant for work like this to receive a grade, which is a kind of really complicated issue, I think. It seemed to help that I treated the course as an opportunity for learning for all of us, including myself. So I tried to do the exercises that I set the students as well, and I talked about the challenges and complexities that I could see in my own experience. And another source of communication between me and my students was the message in a bottle exercise that we did at the end of each class, where students would write a written note with a question or insight from that week's content. But as hopefully you may have seen, I'll put the slideshow on again at the end, an unexpected byproduct of that was the drawings that the students did as well. And we had, as you probably saw earlier, quite a few curriculum adjacent drawings. We did have a real fascination with croissants for a period in the middle of the course. I don't understand what that come from. We had a really impressive range of drawings of bottles. I have to say, I never showed any of my artwork to the class because mine is so much at the level of a, well, not very talented 4-year-old, really. So I was really always impressed by what people were doing. But it was really interesting how people used drawings to explore themes that we were looking at in class. So one of the themes was about how in elite academic environments we get trapped into an idea of competition with each other. We're trying to kind of reach the top of our professional field or degree, building always to the next thing, and actually realising that that process can make us deeply unhappy. It's a bit like the idea of a midlife crisis being a process of climbing to the top of your ladder, only realising that you've put it up against the wrong wall. So that being captured very well in that drawing there. Or the idea of being inspired by just the sheer remarkable nature of the existence of life and the existence of our consciousness through the process of cosmic formation, and the idea of Brian Swimm's universe story and the universe expanding from something so small, potentially as the size of an acorn, but also thinking about, you also see how very bad I was at taking pictures, so people didn't write in blurred, I just wasn't very good at focusing the camera. The idea of the moral circle and how, whether we think about those closest to us, what responsibility we feel for those, and how we balance that between those who are far away, forms of life that are far away, the environment that's far away, communities that are far away. One student here reflecting on whether that's balanced by small acts of care for those around us, but if we all did that, that somehow actually can translate into a wider ecology of care in the world around us. So a second insight was about the ways in which the students talked about how this process of reflection had changed them. And I found it interesting that this change was generally not that they came up with a new list of values that they adhered to. It wasn't about a radical change in lifestyle, although many of us became curious about bits of our life that we might want to change. And it wasn't usually about a changed viewpoint on a specific moral debate. The change was more often about the students' relationship to themselves, and through this to other people and their wider moral circle. A number described how this process of reflection had sharpened a kind of moral attentiveness for them, a sensitivity to the responses that they made morally or didn't make morally in different situations. And in some cases it was an awareness of things in themselves or in their relationships that weighed down on their moral selves. Several wrote about their new understanding about their relationship between their moral framework and their mental and emotional well-being, and how their own process of self-development was its own source of moral insight. And whilst I came to recognise how raw and sensitive this is an issue from many of our students, how important thinking about ideas of experiences of the relative presence or absence of privilege in our life is very, very important in terms of often people's sense of developing moral responsibility. So to give a more specific flavour of the kind of self-involving work that the students produce, I just want to give you a flavour of some of the things that they wrote about that were personally meaningful to them. These are kind of paraphrases. And as I'm just going through these, I'm very conscious of particular students for whom these were important. In some cases, these were things for just one student. In some cases, they articulate something that was important for more than one of them. So these are things where people are saying, I'm learning to. So I'm learning to begin to shift my patterns of negative thoughts by finding a stronger sense of moral purpose. I'm learning to recognise how social media has distanced me from human values and genuine emotional depth, and how I want to change my relationship to it. I'm learning to reevaluate my values in the face of abuse that has happened in my religious network. I'm learning to live with the differences between the values of my home community and that of the more privileged environment of the University of Edinburgh. I am learning to develop a more ethical form of self-expression in the age of fast fashion. That wasn't my one, by the way. I'm learning to reject the patriarchal religion of my childhood and to find parts of my tradition which promote gender equality and social justice. I'm learning to see that honesty and doubt are a healthy part of my faith and values. I'm learning to bridge between respect for my family history of migration and my friendship network in which people are sometimes hostile to immigration. I'm learning to make sense of how my values have remained the same or changed as I've moved through different social worlds. I'm learning to reevaluate my faith and moral centre through learning more about Palestinian history and experience. I'm learning to develop a moral centre for my life beyond the competitiveness of elite academic institutions. I'm learning to understand what loyalty to my country and to principles of freedom and democracy mean when they're under serious threat of attack, even if it means being willing to fight and die for them. Now, people who thought seriously about issues like that don't just sound like future-ready students to me. They sound like good company. I learned from their reflections. I felt often very humbled by the sensitive insights that they produced in their work. And we talked in class about how significant learning can be things that we often return to and remember many years after it had happened, and we wondered whether the learning on the course would be something that we'd also remember. A third insight was that although the course placed a really strong emphasis on active listening rather than trying to argue your point and win the debate with the people that you disagreed with, none of the students were converted to moral relativism. All of them described a clear sense of values at the end that mattered deeply to them, with no sense that these were just opinions or expressions of personal taste. But what many described instead was that they also felt a greater interest in listening to and understanding other people with whom they disagreed, and a bit less of an emotional instinct to rush in or to challenge or to change them. When explaining at the start of the course why they'd wanted to do it, quite a few of the students said that they wanted to be able to talk with other people about their strong moral commitments, people who didn't share those commitments, but without getting angry or frustrated or generally overheated. And it was striking how many talked about how by the end of the course they felt somewhat more able to do this. Now, these outcomes, it's important to say, are by no means any state of perfection or finished work. If it takes, as it is alleged, 10,000 hours to develop any form of expertise, then to develop, in terms of developing kind of deep moral self-awareness, deep moral reflexivity, this course got us about 1/50th of the way there. And I think we've got a lot more to learn about students' learning process through this kind of education, and I'm also less sure about some of the hypotheses that I started with in designing this course in terms of seeing what actually mattered to students going through the process. But there is still work to do, but we learned from each other, we made progress, and we thought about and wrote about things that I think hopefully will last for us. And I'm delighted to say that although we still haven't quite got to the contract, we're nearly there, so we still can't fully announce all of the details, but we are now at the stage of finalising substantial funding from an external funder to develop this course more and to explore the feasibility of extending this across a number of other universities across Europe. So, part 3, back to Daphne Aurum. The time is right for such experiments. So, as I said earlier, talking about an educational intervention is an unusual thing to do in an inaugural lecture. That's a difficult thing to say. Practice that at home later on. Should have done that earlier, shouldn't I? Anyway, to explain this choice a bit more, in this final part of the lecture, I want to take a step back and explain why I think this work is timely, and if not timely, actually urgent, and what it might mean for us to take this work forward. Now, I think few of us would disagree that we're living in challenging times. It's not new to imagine that we're living in a time where the future feels very precarious. I was, after all, part of a generation that grew up thinking that a nuclear Armageddon was a very realistic prospect in my adult life. And visions of the imminent end of the world have recurred throughout history. But we can't doubt that our world today is deeply uncertain, that challenge and change and disruption are very much with us. Public confidence in political institutions is in retreat. The exercise of power seems to be trumping principles of global order and human rights. And social media have accelerated the rise of polarised post-truth societies. And in the midst of this, we see more and more people feeling cynical and despairing about established ideas and authorities. And as Rutger Bregman has argued in his recent Wreath lectures, it's moments of public disenchantment like this that are times of great opportunity, but they're also times of great risk, depending on which of the ideas and which of the people to whom people now turn. If there was ever a time when moral wisdom was badly needed, this is it right now. And the University of Edinburgh is far from being alone in higher education, I think quite rightly, in thinking again about the purpose of its educational work in terms of preparing students for the kind of world that they'll be shaping in the future. And if this is the situation that we're in, I think this work is made all the more urgent because I think we currently lack a clear integrated framework for doing it across our schools and colleges and university. One of the really striking things that a number of students said taking this course was that it was the first time that they'd engaged in sustained reflection about their personal moral commitments. Now, maybe that's surprising for the now clear majority of young people who identify as non-religious. The sociologist of religion in me is really tempted to get into a sidetrack about how the recent surveys showing a sort of return to church amongst younger people actually are not quite what they seem. There's a really good study by the National Centre for Social Research that shows that actually that growth doesn't actually make up for the numbers who stopped going to church during the COVID years. And we know that actually the proportion of younger people still around 60% still clearly identify as non-religious. So that kind of non-religious part of the population, which doesn't necessarily mean you don't pray or you don't believe in God, just that you're not formed in a very particular religious framework, that's a significant part of the population. But through schools education, people with that background are often not helped to think critically or to articulate their values and beliefs. And often values education in schools can stray a bit more, as Anna and Rachel said in this really excellent recent study, can stray more into attempts at behaviour management. But it's striking that students talking about this being a first time in which they'd really reflected deeply on their personal commitments are also coming often from religious backgrounds as well, and had found that their faith communities had really failed to encourage open, critical reflection. And there are a number of students who were coming to question their own communities more as cases of abuse led them to reevaluate their trust in the institutions that they were part of, and they've experienced increasing gaps between their own lived experience and the established teachings around gender and sexuality that they'd grown up with. Now, there are clearly places across higher education and the people in this room who are doing this work and in our subject area where some students are already doing this work on meaningful self-reflection, and wherever this is happening, this is to be welcomed. But I think we should be cautious to assume that simply teaching students about traditions of belief or forms of ethical thinking necessarily mean that they integrate this content into their lives in personally meaningful ways. And let me explain why I think that, and this is where we get into Duna's research with other colleagues. So just over 20 years ago, a piece of research was undertaken at the University of Oxford exploring the relationship between students' personal religious beliefs and faith and their experience of academic study of theology. One of the central findings from this work was that students often came to university to a degree like this, expecting there to be an opportunity to have some kind of meaningful integration between their personal commitments and their academic study. But they quickly found that this was something that their academic teachers didn't really support at all, either simply by omitting it as something that was being talked about or by actively discouraging it. And while students negotiated this experience in different ways, a common pattern was for them to come to recognise in their first year that there were academic rules of the game that they had to follow, which excluded discussion of personal commitment. And like Irving Goffman's idea of people as skillful social actors, these students learned to perform what it meant to be a competent academic in theology and the study of religion, demonstrating the relevant intellectual knowledge and skills for a particular class or assignment, but without this necessarily relating in any meaningful way to what they thought or valued or believed about themselves and the world. And to cultivate what Goffman calls deep performance, where our forms of expression and self-expression and performance and communication actually align more authentically with our inner lives, that gap needs to be bridged. And the Oxford study concluded that the provision of curriculum space to explore the interaction between the existential and the academic is a key factor for subjects such as theology and religious studies, which contain a significant self-involving element. So about 17 years after Duna wrote that, I actually got around to designing this course. Very similar to the length of time it takes me to do DIY jobs sometimes, actually, as well. So ultimately, the work that I've described tonight with the Understanding Your Values course is really just one small part of a much bigger ecology that I think we need to develop in our educational systems for moral self-reflection and the cultivation of moral wisdom. As we develop this work more, we're going to be benefiting hugely from the work of colleagues in the human and social sciences who help us to understand how morality is embedded into our lives, what shapes our moral perceptions, and how we can use that knowledge, as you do, to promote social change and to promote the social good. We will benefit hugely from people who can help us to understand different traditions of moral wisdom, whether religious or philosophical, and to think about how we can learn from those in relation to our lives. We'll also find it deeply enriched by people who can help to unlock for us the ways in which people have struggled with questions of meaning and value through the rich heritage of literature and the arts as another form of expressing that. All of us in this room have a huge amount to contribute from that to this work simply by learning from each other. But at the moment, I feel we're all doing this valuable work in ways that are too siloed. And the time is right now, not just for understanding your values, but for a much bigger experiment in which we all join this work together in ways that can take forward this project to greater moral self-awareness, wisdom, and change. So thinking back to the student with whom we began this lecture tonight, if we can do this, this might help us feel a bit more grounded, a bit more hopeful, a bit more forgiving of human failures and limitations, including our own, and a bit less lost. I can't think of anything else I'd rather do with my time here, and I hope I've said enough this evening to encourage us all to think that this is valuable work to which we all have something important to contribute. Thank you.